Hello YouTube, and welcome to this ultimate traps exercises tier list. As you can tell, it's coming out sooner than usual because the previous one was barely 2 weeks ago. And if you missed it, it's of course found in the description. It was the one about the best chest exercises. I also did one for the best biceps and triceps exercises. And the one that is connected to this trap installment was of course the latissimus dorsi one. I decided to separate these two tier lists because to me, the best exercise for the lats will not necessarily be the best exercise for the traps. That only makes sense. That way you have twice as many exercises to pick from and you know which one is going to train what. For the lats installment, I also included movements that develop the teres major and minor. So for today's installment for the traps, I'm also including movements that are going to be great for your rhomboids, not just the upper, lower, and middle portions of the traps. We want exercises that develop the entirety of the yoke, which also explains why this tier list is not just going to be shrugs. It would be fairly boring, and on top of that, it would be incomplete. There are many other movement patterns that develop the traps, and you should include all of them in your training program if you want to get as much gains as possible. To facilitate the navigation of this tier list, I organized every movement by families. So usually they are paired. You'll see 3 types of shrugs in a row. That way it helps me compare them and explain to you why one of them might be bad and the other is better. The traps, in my opinion, is a vastly underestimated and misunderstood muscle group. Many people don't really know how to train them, so today that's what I want to teach you. It also is going to help clear some misconception and confusion about the tiers. I see some people in the comments of these videos sometimes don't understand why this lift is B tier while this one is A, and if you compare the two, it looks like they're the same. I want to include reasons so as to make sure you understand why I say certain things. Sometimes a movement will be C tier even though it's technically better than one in B tier because it has other variations, other family members, quote unquote, that are much better, and therefore I cannot encourage you guys to do it when there is a better alternative out there. So that is for that. Now, when it comes to today's tier list that I selected, we start with the Shrimptier. The Shrimptier is the worst tier, it's D tier. These are movements that are not going to get you anywhere. The reason why I call it Shrimptier is because in French, a very small man, especially a man with no yoke and a small neck and upper back, we call him une crevette, and it translates into shrimp. These movements are a waste of your time. You should not be doing them if you want bigger traps. Then there is the C tier, the mediocre tier. These are movements that work the traps a bit, but are much better for other muscle groups, and therefore for traps development and upper back, you just can ditch them. They are fairly useless. Then there is the decent tier, the B tier, that include a ton of movement that you guys think are good for the traps, but are actually better for other muscle groups because the other muscle groups limit the development of the traps. We're going to get into that once you see the movements I included in there. Then there is the excellence tier. We're starting to talk about very good movements that I think you guys should include because they're skewed towards trap development as opposed to the B tier. And then there is the one on top, there is the king of kings, the S tier, that I deemed and named Leonidas-tier for 3 reasons. First one, because it sounds cool. Second reason, because to me, the man that is responsible for the development and for the popularization of trap training on YouTube Fitness is Alexander Leonidas, aka Alpha Destiny. He did a ton of great videos about how to develop that muscle group, and he also dispelled many of the myths that I will be dispelling in this video as well. So as an homage, I named the tier list after him. Then the third reason is because there's a video coming out very soon that is connected with the name of Leonidas. Maybe some of you guys can guess what it is. And now that the tier lists have been established, we can move on to the tier list proper. Starting with a movement that many people consider to be the only thing you need for traps, the deadlift. I start with it right off the bat to establish what traps exercises are going to be at the top and which ones are going to be poorly graded. To me, the deadlift is only a decent trap movement. Why? Because the traps are not maximally challenged. The deadlift is a posterior chain movement. What limits you on that movement is your lower back, your glutes, and your hamstrings. If you want bigger traps, yes, the deadlifts will grow them, but it's not optimal. Now, you will find people who have been spamming pulls from the floor and deadlifts for 10 years and they have massive traps and upper backs, because it's also a myth to think that the deadlift only develops the upper traps. It stretches the entirety of the upper back because you start bent over and therefore it grows it all. But it does not mean that it is the best thing for traps. These people would have gotten better results if they also included A and S tier exercises. And talking about that, the next one, the rack pull, is ranked above the deadlift naturally. Why? Because you start with a bar higher up your chins and therefore you can use more weight and the traps get stretched more. It's as simple as that. With traps training, usually for the most part, the more weight you can grab onto and move and hold, the best it is for the trap development. I know that many people have this misconception in their heads that somehow because the deadlift has more range of motion, it's best for the traps. Guys, the range of motion of the deadlift is for the posterior chain. Your traps are doing the same thing throughout the range of motion. They just stretch. That's all they do. Yes, if you start very bent over, you get more middle and lower traps, but there are better ways to develop that. So if you can use more weight and hold on to more weight with the bar into your hands, you are going to get better traps result. Meaning that the above the knee rack pull naturally lends itself into Leonidas-tier. I know that some people like to make fun of it because there's no range of motion. If you compare the amount of weight you can use for a deadlift and the amount of weight you can use for a above the knee rack pull, you will find that you can almost double the load. So you will get double the amount of work for the traps. It also means, logically, that the deadlift is much better than the above the knee rack pull for posterior chain development because there is no hip hinge component in the above knee rack pull, which is also why you can lift so much weight and why it's so great for the traps. Then there is the face pulse. Now, for many people, the face pulse is a shoulder exercise that is technically correct. However, you can modify your form to skew the movements towards the development of the traps, in which case you will be able to find that you can use much more weight, which makes that movement decent tier. Yes, decent tier. I know many people will tell me, what? The deadlift is just as good as the face pulse? Yes, because there are better movements than the deadlift in the same family. It's what I taught you at the start. Also, the face pull will develop more of the middle back in particular, will allow for a better squeeze and a better isolation. Compare the total fatigue to stimulus ratio of a deadlift. Compared to a face pulse, the face pulse is much better to target the traps in particular. So this is why it is B tier. Then there is something that many people will laugh at because they have never thought of it as a trap movement. But anyone who has done starting strength or spoken to anyone 10 years ago on bodybuilding forums will tell you that many lifters thought that this was good for trap development, and that is the overhead press. That to me is Shrimptier. There is no discussion to be had. The traps do not grow much from an overhead press. The portion of the movement that triggers the traps the most is at the top. So some people tell you that you have to lock out and do a shrug at the top. That's a meme, guys. That's a gimmick. The overhead press is for shoulders. Don't waste your time for trap development with this. You are not going to get the results that you think. Which also means that something like an overhead shrug, which isolates the top portion of the overhead press that triggers the trap development, is not going to be that great either. It is mediocre tier. You can get a good sensation for it. It is good for shoulder health and for shoulder mobility. But to get a massive yoke, yeah, you're completely wasting your time with that type of overhead movement because that's simply not the function that the trap is designed to fulfill. The trap, for the most part, stretches and catches weight that you're holding into your hands. So any movement above your head doesn't align with that characteristic. And while it is absolutely true that the traps also stabilize the shoulders when you're pressing both horizontally or vertically, that is simply not the function of the trap that is going to get you the most gains. I guarantee you that. If you want gains, for the most part, as I said, you're going to have to hold on to weight and then let the traps do their job, which includes either doing a passive stretch or an active stretch with a shrug, where you shrug your shoulders up. And with the dumbbell shoulder shrug, you're getting exactly that. Now, I'm going to place this one in decent tier because in the big families of shrugs, this one to me is not the greatest for the simple reason that you are limited by dumbbells. The traps are, as I said, extremely strong, probably one of the strongest part of your body in reality because of the limited range of motion. And therefore, even if you have in your gym something like 150-pound dumbbells, you could always do more than that with a barbell. So I don't see why you would limit yourself with that. The one good aspect of the dumbbell for the shrugs
is that it puts the shoulder in a natural position, a neutral position that many people find very comfortable. The dumbbells will not run into your body because they're sitting outside of your hips. So these are good, but again, since you can use so much more weight with a barbell or other implements, this one is only B tier. An A tier shrug would be something like a snatch grip shrug that I personally favor greatly. I find that having a wider grip on the shrug helps recruit more of the middle of the traps. Overall, a good addition to any program. Extremely good stimulus to fatigue ratio because you're standing upright, so no lower back fatigue. If you have never tried snatch grip shrugs, I absolutely recommend you give them a try. But since the arms are outside, it's a little bit uncomfortable, so you might not be able to use as much weight as you would with a regular grip. And this is when we introduce the second S tier, Leonidas-tier movement for the traps, the power shrug. The power shrug is done with a regular grip. The only difference is that you are going to explode up, shrug up with the momentum, and then catch the weight. For many people, I know that this is heresy, it's blasphemy, because it's poor form, it's cheating. Guess what? The traps don't know that. Your traps are not keeping count and looking if you're doing perfect, cute reps of shrugs. If anything, clean form, slow and controlled tempos on shrugs is detrimental to hypertrophy. Something like a power shrug fulfills the role of the trap, which is to stretch to catch the weight.
The amount of tension you will get when you catch all of that weight that you're using on the power shrug is tremendous. So it really does not matter if you don't go all the way up like this at the top of the power shrug. What matters is that when you go down, you are catching that weight. This is a lesson to keep in mind. Too many people have this more range of motion is better mindset. It simply doesn't align for the traps. For the most part, more weight is better for the traps. So the best shrug to develop that yoke and to blow up your upper back is always going to be a power shrug. There is a risk of injury, but it's not as high as you think because your torso remains vertical, of course. You do not want to bend over or to do a hip hinge for this. The goal is to explode straight. Then we're moving back into a different function of the trap, which is again the ability to stabilize the shoulder overhead. With an overhead carry, that is also Shrimptier to me. Yes, the trap is recruited. Yes, it might be burning as you do your overhead carry, but as I explained previously, the trap is not stretching, it's only stabilizing, it has a passive role, and therefore you won't get much gains out of it. When it comes to carries, there are much better options out there. For example, a dumbbell farmer's carries that I'm placing in decent tier. Just like with dumbbell shrugs, to me it's the same problem. The farmer carry is a godlike movement for the traps, but you're supposed to use a lot of weight. So if you grab the hundreds, what are you going to do? You're going to take a lap around the gym for 2 minutes or 3 minutes. Most of the time, your grip will be the limiting factor. It really is not the proper way to do your farmer's carries. Instead, what I recommend is to use an implement that was literally built and engineered for that, and that is a frame. So you can do something like a frame hold that some people call a farmer's hold. That is excellent. You don't have to work with it. You can just pick it up and wait. That is literally all it takes to grow big traps. Let the weight stretch the traps and you will get hypertrophic responses and benefits from that. This is a guaranteed. But it doesn't mean that you have to remain static to develop your yoke. As I explained, the power shrugs is one of the best movements for that area. So what if we took that frame and we worked with it? Well, this is how you turn something that is already good into something that is great, and that is the farmer's carries. To be honest with you guys, this shouldn't even be Leonidas-tier, it should be above it. There should be a tier just for that movement because, and I weight my words here, farmer's carries are the best movement for the traps. There is everything in it. Very heavy weight, outside of the hips, so it's not going to run into your body. You have to balance it. You can use straps, so the forearms are not a limiting factor. And on top of that, something that people underestimate, there is the up and down movement of you walking with the weight that the traps have to work twice as hard to stabilize the shoulders, and you get insane stimulus from it. When they see that exercise, many people think, oh, it's great for the hips because you have to do one foot after the other. That is true, but keep in mind that the shoulders also have to follow that movement. And when you look at the weight, you see that it's not static. The weights go up and down. And when they go up and down, the traps have to stretch and then contract simultaneously in very fast successions to be able to keep your shoulders aligned, because If you weren't doing that, you would fall onto one side. This is why anyone who has ever done Formless carries will tell you that they give you the best type of dumps for the traps, and it's the entirety of the traps as well, because it's a little bit like the above the knee rack pull. Naturally, your thoracic spine is going to start rounding at some point to make the lift easier, meaning that you also start recruiting more middle and lower traps as well. So if you have never done that movement and you have the implement in your gym, please start. Your yoke and your traps are going to blow the fuck up. Which explains, by the way, why strongmans all have massive traps. Is because a lot of the movements that they do include heavy pulls and include heavy holds as well. But there's also another sport that is widely known for growing big traps, and that is Olympic weightlifting. So I selected a few movements to place into the tier list to make you guys understand which ones are good and which ones are a waste of time. To be the first one, the dumbbell or kettlebell snatch is a waste of time. It is only mediocre, because the amount of weight you're going to be able to use on that movement that is highly technical and balance based is not going to be enough to really trigger traps hypertrophy. You can always find a better alternative. And to me, a better alternative would be something like a power clean. The power clean is decent. It's just like a deadlift in my opinion. It's the same starting position pretty much. The issue being, of course, that you catch the weight instead of standing upright, and some could tell me, well, this means that it's worse for the traps. Understand that the front rack hold position also works the traps. It works the traps in an isometric contraction faction, but it still works the traps. This is why some people experience traps dumps when they do front squats. Does it make that particular position of the rack hold a good thing to develop traps? No. What grows the traps of Olympic weightlifters is, again, all of the dangling of the weight off of their arms. So if we maximize the dangling component of Olympic weightlifting movements, we can get even better results. And this is why a hang clean pull is going to be placed in excellent tier. As opposed to a power clean where you pull off the floor, the hang clean pull forces you to let the bar dangle off of your body, and it never touches the floor. On top of that, we remove the technical component of the clean, because there is no technical clean in the hang clean pull. You're just exploding with the weight back up. Now, I want to make clear, and this is something that I'm going to talk about in the next movement, that there are variations of range of motions when it comes to these movements. Some people will pull high to their belly button, some people to their sternum. It really is up to you. You will come to understand with the next movement that, again, more range of motion is not necessarily better. It's a hang snatch pull, so your hands are in a snatch position. And I place that in Leonidas-tier. Now, the reason why this one is S tier and not the hang clean pull is purely personal. It's because I feel the snatch grip more in my upper back as opposed to regular grip. In truth, these two could be interchangeable. I could also have pulled the hang clean pull in your last tier. So I really recommend that you just try it for yourself and see which ones you prefer. Now, to go back onto the topic of range of motion, many people, when they do something like the hang snatch pull, will go as high as their chest, sternum, or even sometimes neck. That is great because it engages more shoulder, but for traps development, it is simply not needed. You can go to your belly button and that is all that you will need, because what matters is mostly the fact that you will be catching the weight at the bottom. So if you can use more weight, you'll have more to catch, the traps will be stretched more. The more upward movement there is and the more you go high like this, the more you're going to start to recruit the shoulders. So it's a better movement if you want to be a better Olympic weightlifter and get stronger, but it's less functional for bodybuilding. And the proof I have of that is the next movement, the upright row, that looks very similar to these hang cleans and that I'm placing in the mediocre tier. If you look at what happens to the body and the position of the body in an upright row, essentially what it is it is a extremely strict hang snatch pull, which also means that 1, you can use less weight, and 2, you recruit the shoulders a lot more. So naturally, in the same line of thinking, I cannot rank the upright row higher for trap development. Then there's the question of rows. So people will tell you that depending on the angle of the elbow, you're going to recruit more or less lats or more or less traps. That is true. For the most part, if your elbow is tucked in like this, you're going to recruit more lats. And if it's open like this, you're going to recruit more upper back. This doesn't mean, however, that rows done with a closed elbow don't recruit the traps. They do. They just recruit them less. So if we want to maximize the development of the area, we have to select movements with that open elbow position, the pendlay row being a good example. A movement that many people do without necessarily realizing that they're actively targeting the traps and not the lats, which is why I am placing the pendlay row in a decent tier. The issue I have with the movement is that because there is technically no negative, because you just let the weight go, and also because the weight doesn't dangle from the body at any point, you have to use less weight, there is less stretch, yada yada yada. You're starting to understand that the traps require all of these things to develop maximally. So it's not a bad movement, but you can always do better. And to me, the better option when it comes to rows and developing the traps is the famous Croc Rule that goes straight into S tier. A Croc row is a row done in front of the body where the weight never touches the floor and where you use a lot of body English and cheating to get the weight up.
And then you catch the dumbbell with the lats. Because the weight is in front of you, of course, and not to the side like with a regular dumbbell row like this, the entirety of the upper back is going to be recruited more and favorably as opposed to the middle back and the lats. So if you have never tried that type of dumbbell row before, absolutely give it a try and your traps will thank you for it. What you shouldn't be doing, however, is using a cable to train your traps. Think back to all of the movements we placed in S tier. What do they all have in common? What they have in common is that at one point or the other, the traps have to catch the weight and they have to hold the weight so as to stabilize the shoulders. With a cable, this never happens. The cable does that for you. So the negative is restricted, the amount of stretch is also restricted, and you only really get the stretch at the top, which is not that important for the traps. So even though this is very severe, I'm going to place it in Shrimptier because when you look at all of the other better versions of shrugs out there, I do not see why anyone would do them using a cable. If you are tired of doing your dumbbell shrugs or power shrugs or whatever, and you want some variety in your training, what you can try instead is the behind the back curl. That is an excellent exercise. Some find it uncomfortable, some don't know how to do it. A behind the back curl is not a regular curl and that your arms will not be able to remain fully extended. You'll have to have a bend at the elbow, but you will find that it might help you recruit more middle and lower traps. If you have a fat ass, it might be a problem because the bar is going to run into it, but you can always bend forward a bit and it should make the movements easier. This is the type of motion that you either love or you absolutely hate. I know that for me, my shoulders don't like that position, but you might be the type that actually loves it, and in that case, absolutely do them, they will blow up your traps. But in the world of shrugs and in the world of implements to use for shrugs, there is something better, something that is also often very misunderstood and underrated by people because they think that the implement is for athletes. That is the trap bar. Guys, the trap bar was created for shrugs because again, the weight sits outside of your hips so the bar doesn't run into your balls or into your ass. And you can just shrug upwards. You can do power shrugs with it. You can do Formless carries with it. So straight into Leonidas-tier. Now understand that you do get different benefits if the bar is in front or to the side. I know that many shrugs and movements with a barbell in front of the body will recruit more of that middle back musculature, and something like the trap bar might be better for pure upper traps. But that list should provide you with all of the information you need so as to develop the traps in every single angle possible. Then we have another entry of a movement that people do thinking it grows their traps when in reality it's accessory at best to the movement, and that is the pull-up. The pull-up is a mediocre trap exercise. It's excellent for the lats, it's excellent for the teres major and minor, but for everything rhomboids and upper back thickness, yeah, you won't get much of that from that movement. I know that some people look at someone doing pull-ups and they think, well, the traps look very visible.
Guys, just because the traps look visible during a motion does not mean that they are trained optimally. In this case, there is some involvement, especially when you squeeze your shoulder blades together at the top. But if you do only pull-ups for traps, you are never going to have a big yoke. This is also why doing shrugs in a pull-up position is not going to get you much of anything. I'm actually putting it below the pull-ups in Shrimptier because what really activates the traps is again that top portion of the range of motion. But when you're doing a pull-up, even though technically gravity is still pulling you downwards, the traps are not fulfilling their stretching function that they do when you're holding onto weight. This is why you have to pay close attention to the function that a muscle fulfills when doing a certain lift and not just rely on sensations. And this is also true with our next entry, the lateral raise. Many lifters fill their traps tremendously, especially the upper trap, on lateral raises. Does it make it a good trap exercise? No, it's a mediocre trap exercise. There is no stretch and you cannot use as much weight because, again, the mover is the shoulder, and the shoulder in that plane of motion cannot move much, so the trap ends up limited by default. And that also is true for the bent over lateral raises that I know many people think works the traps more than the shoulders. That is not the case. It still is a shoulder exercise first and foremost. You can still do these movements, they're not bad movements, but if you replace A tier and S tier exercises for the traps by these, thinking you're going to get the same results and the same growth, you won't. You're going to have a lot of shoulder growth, but not much trap growth at all. Now we're moving on to 3 lifts that are legendary because of their inventor, and these are the Reeves lifts. And I'm going to make some enemies, but they're bad. They're all bad for trap development for reasons I'm going to explain right now. We're going to start with the Reeves incline rows. It's an incline row where instead of grabbing onto the bar or the dumbbell, you grab onto the plate. That is just terrible for the traps. It's Shrimptier. One, because you grab onto the plate, you are forced to have tucked in elbows. So you're going to recruit more of the lats and of the middle back. Then there's the fact that you're limiting the amount of weight you can move because you're literally grabbing and gripping the plate instead of the bar, which also means that you get less overall stretch for the traps. Thankfully, this lift is not popular at all, so I know that none of you guys are actually doing it for trap development. The next one, however, is famous. I know that many people like it for trap development. There's also this idea that Reeves himself was spreading that it would give you bigger shoulders or wider shoulders, it would blow up your frame. I disagree with that notion. We're not there to talk about that. We'll talk about traps today. And for trap development, the Reeves deadlift is only mediocre. Because even though you're technically getting a lot of trap stretch from the shoulder position, because the arms are completely outward to be able to grab the plates, you also have to consider that this means you can use much less weight. And since we know that the stretch component is the most important for trap development, it doesn't really matter the type of position that your hands are into. If it means that you have to cut the weight in half, that is half the stimulus for the traps, then there's the fact that you're holding onto a plate and it's still technically a deadlift, so from the floor, it cannot be higher than C tier. The Reeves Shrugs managed to sneak themselves into decent tier, but for the same reason, why exactly would you do your shrugs like this when you could just do snatch grip shrugs with straps? Like, there is no advantage of the Reeves Shrugs over the snatch grip shrugs. It's a legendary lift because of Reeves. Many people enjoy it because it is very cool, don't get me wrong, but for pure bodybuilding and pure hypertrophy, all of these lifts can be ignored because they are simply not what you need for trap development. But they're always better than doing snow angels. So a snow angel is you being on your belly and you do exactly that. You do a reverse snow angel where your hands move from your hips to the top of your head. You will find that it gives a great sensation and burn in the traps because it has to stabilize the shoulders as they move and help with the movement, but you will never grow big traps doing that. There is a reason why every single picture I could find of this exercise was demonstrated by a woman. Then we have another batch of shrugs, starting with the Smith machine shrugs that is only decent. I'm not a fan of it for the simple reason that it's still a bit like the cable. The best way to do shrugs is always with weight dangling off of you where you have the full responsibility of catching the weight. And the Smith machine takes care of some of that for you. So even though the contraction at the top is peak, the stretch is mitigated and that makes it only decent. If you're looking for a machine to do shrugs with, I actually recommend the belt squat machine. I know that many of you guys don't have one, but if you do, please give it a try. I've found that they feel excellent and this is why it goes into excellent tier. You can modify the angles, you can shrug very high without losing on the stretch. Overall, it is a great movement for anyone who has never really done any trap isolation. It's very easy to set up. The stimulus to fatigue ratio is excellent. And again, talking about this fatigue to stimulus ratio, you come to understand that all of the movements in excellent and Leonidas-tier put a lot of the stimulus on the traps in particular, and they don't tax the rest of the body. They won't tax your posterior chain, they won't tax your lower back, meaning you can do them more often with more weight and get more results. That is why something like a deadlift could never be higher than B tier. But talking about shrugs and talking about the best way to take out of the equation the rest of the body and just focus on these straps, I think that nothing can beat the following entry, the chest supported incline shrugs. that is Leonidas-tier. What you lose in terms of power and explosiveness to be able to shrug the weight up and then catch it, you gain because
since the entire body is stationary, you can really maximize the stimulus of the traps. On top of that, if you use traps, you can use a ton of weight. Do not be fooled by the picture that I used of the guy using 5 pounds. You can grab the heavier dumbbells in the gym and you can really go to town on your traps, even though it doesn't have the potential for total size that a farmer carries has, for example, because you won't be able to use as much weight. What I find instead with this is that with a slight modification of the incline of the bench, you can target every single area of the upper back. So it's a must try. If you have never attempted it, this might become your new favorite way to do your shrugs. And this especially goes if you're the type of person who has tried in the past to bend your torso forward to recruit more of these lower and middle traps. But I found that it's extremely uncomfortable for the posterior chain and you can't use as much weight, of course. This is your solution right there. Then there's another itty bitty bullshit Shrimptier exercise in the bend pull apart, which again makes you feel your traps tremendously. Your traps will burn because they again have to help in the movement of the shoulder. Does it make it a good trap exercise? Absolutely not. It is total garbage for the traps, but it's good for shoulder health. Then there are kettlebell swings that are only mediocre. Same reason, I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot in this tier list. You cannot use as much weight for a kettlebell swing. You're limited by the size and the weight of the kettlebell and by the strength of your posterior chain. So even though technically there is a stretch, the weight applied to the stretch is not enough to justify it being a good exercise. And then we end with two calisthenics movements that are decent. The first one is the real delt ring rows that are decent tier. I might be very generous in putting that movement there, but it's only because I recently discovered that if you do it with a rope, you can maximize the stretch that you feel when your arms are fully extended at the end of the motion. So you get both a very strong contraction of the middle of your upper back when you are bringing your hands close to your face, and you also get the stretching components at the end. But just like with the face pause, I think that this can be a good movement, an isolation movement for the traps to add to your training to target these small portions of the upper back that you usually neglect with heavy pulls and heavy shrugs. And then we wrap up this tier list with reverse ring flies that I'm putting in mediocre because it's a form of bend pull apart on steroids. Because you use your body weight, you're going to get a better contraction, but you're missing out on the stretch that a real delt ring rows could provide, so it has to be ranked lower. And that is going to conclude this ultimate traps exercises tier list. All of the movements in S tier share a similar characteristics, and that is that the focus is put on the stretch. This is really what you want to emphasize with your trap development.
Don't be the guy that only does perfect form and spams dumbbell shrugs with 50 pounds. That is never going to result in big traps. Don't be the guy also that thinks that you need a full range of motion for the traps. This is the range of motion, and at the end of the day, them just stretching forward to catch weight is plenty. You can get massive just from doing that. And if you add to these movements the lats exercises tier list that I've done a month before, you have every single tool that you need to develop a massive and jacked upper back. And I'm going to leave you with that. So the next tier list is a surprise. It's not going to be a muscle tier list, but keep an eye out for the community tab because I'll soon run a poll to ask you guys which muscle you want to see me cover next. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.